Let me ask you something. What if the worst thing that ever happens to you is actually the only door to a real life? It sounds crazy, right? Nobody imagines that a quiet whisper at an ex's engagement party could flip their whole world. Even less when that whisper comes from the person you're never supposed to cross that line with, your ex's mother. Most people would slam the gavel right away. This is wrong. End of story. But real life doesn't come with neat rules and perfect endings already written for you. And that's exactly why this story makes people uncomfortable, curious, and a little more honest with themselves. Maybe you grew up hearing that your duty is to endure, smile, and keep everything looking fine from the outside. That a perfect marriage, a perfect family, a perfect image matter more than your own peace. There's a harsh truth almost no one says out loud. When you live only not to disappoint others, you slowly abandon yourself. And when someone, in the middle of that shiny lie, dares to want something real, the world doesn't get angry at the desire. It gets angry because the desire exposes everything that was already broken around it. This story is exactly about that. The cost of choosing truth in a world that prefers decoration over reality. In the next minutes, you'll walk beside a man who just wanted to prove he was over it, and ended up pulled into a love nobody would approve of, a love that forced him to ask what it really means to live honestly. You'll also see a woman who had everything to be envied, except the most basic thing, feeling alive in her own life. And as you listen, you may catch yourself thinking about the silent contracts you've signed, what you endure just to keep the picture pretty. I can't promise you a comfortable story, but I can promise this. If you stay to the end, you won't look at other people's judgment the same way again. And you may stop postponing a few decisions you've been avoiding for years. Michael never expected that elegant evening to be the start of something so messy. He was standing in his ex-girlfriend's family estate, surrounded by designer suits and magazine cover smiles. 8 months after the breakup with Rebecca, his stomach still tightened just seeing her parents' house. He'd accepted the invitation mostly to prove to himself that he was fine now, that his heart had healed. But as he moved through the crowd with his crystal glass and fake small talk, he knew he didn't belong there. Sometimes life takes you to the very place you'd rather avoid, just because something important is waiting for you there. Trying to breathe, Michael slipped away from the main terrace and headed toward the lavender garden. The jazz music faded into the background, like it belonged to another planet entirely. His phone rang right then. It was his younger brother, Lucas, voice shaking with excitement. After years of late nights and near burnouts, Lucas had finally been accepted into medical school. For the first time that night, Michael smiled for real, overflowing with pride and affection. In that moment, he wasn't an ex at an awkward party. He was just a big brother who'd watched someone he loved fight for a dream. While he congratulated Lucas and teased him a little, the air shifted around him. Through the lavender bushes, he noticed a woman standing alone, fingers tight around a champagne flute. Her dress screamed money and status, but her eyes looked like they didn't belong to that world at all. Then he heard it, a soft line, barely louder than a breath. "I wish I had a man like you." The words were quiet, but they sliced through his conversation like a blade. In a heartbeat, his call with Lucas became background noise. All his attention collapsed onto that voice. It took him a few seconds to place her. It was Diana, Rebecca's mother, the polite, distant figure he'd seen at dinners. In his mind, she'd always been just the elegant mom, part of the expensive scenery around his ex. But now he wasn't seeing a hostess. He was seeing a lonely woman talking to herself, forgetting the world was listening. Michael felt the impulse to pretend he hadn't heard, to walk away and stay out of trouble. Yet something in him, that part that can't ignore someone quietly falling apart, refused to move. By choosing to walk toward her instead of disappearing, he nudged the first domino in a line he couldn't yet see. He hesitated for a moment, like someone stepping onto thin ice, unsure if it will hold. He didn't want Diana to think he was mocking her or spying on her worst moment. So he cleared his throat gently, just enough to announce himself without startling her. She turned quickly, eyes wide, caught in a vulnerability she never planned to show. Almost on instinct, she put on a polite social smile, the kind you learn to wear at wealthy events. But Michael noticed instantly. That smile never even came close to reaching her eyes. "I thought you'd already left," she said, trying to sound light and hostess-like. Michael replied that he was thinking about it, but that the garden felt much more honest than the dance floor. A brief silence settled between them, heavy with things neither knew how to name. He made a neutral comment about how beautiful the party was, more to be kind than to state a real opinion. She agreed that yes, everything was perfect, exactly the way it was supposed to look. But when she said perfect, her voice trembled just enough to reveal the crack in the picture. Michael took a breath and decided not to dance around the obvious like everyone else in that house would. In a calm voice, he told her he had heard what she said and that he hadn't meant to overhear. The color drained from Diana's face, like someone had turned her from marble into fragile glass. She lowered her gaze, ashamed, already picturing invisible headlines, and whispered gossip in those same corridors. "I shouldn't have said that," she murmured, more to herself than to him, scolding her own heart. But instead of taking advantage of her embarrassment, Michael did something rare in that world. He stayed quiet to listen. Little by little, like a door that hasn't been opened in years, Diana began to speak honestly. From the outside, her life looked like a fairy tale. Perfect house, powerful husband, successful children. Inside, her marriage to Thomas had been hollow for years. Conversations reduced to schedules, events, business. Before all that, she had been a textile designer, in love with fabrics, colors, and the stories they could tell. She had put that entire part of herself into a box to become the right kind of wife and impeccable mother. Michael looked at her with a quiet seriousness and dropped a simple, dangerous idea. Maybe she wasn't falling apart. Maybe she was finally waking up. The next day, Michael tried to slip back into his normal routine as if nothing had happened. But while he made coffee and checked emails, the image of Diana alone in that garden kept surfacing. It wasn't just what she said, but how tired her voice sounded, like someone who'd been acting for too long. He kept telling himself it wasn't his problem, that her life was too complicated, too tangled. But when something really touches you, pretending it doesn't matter rarely works for long. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just a random sad moment. It was a crack in a carefully painted wall. When his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, he almost ignored it. The message was short and surprisingly direct. "This is Diana. I hope it's okay that I got your number. Would you like to meet for coffee somewhere quiet so we can talk?" In his head, the logical side started listing all the reasons to say no. History, age, family, complications. But there was one strong reason to say yes. The brutal honesty he'd seen in her eyes the night before. After a long minute staring at the screen, he typed what his heart had decided already. "Yes, I'd like that." They chose a small cafe on the other side of town, far away from Rebecca's polished social circle. When Diana walked in, he almost didn't recognize her without the rich wife uniform. She wore simple jeans, a soft sweater, and her hair seemed more relaxed, less controlled. She looked lighter and more nervous at the same time, like someone doing something forbidden and necessary. He'd already ordered the kind of coffee Rebecca once said Diana liked. Extra cream and sugar, which surprised her. That tiny detail, remembered without effort, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Their conversation started cautious, like two people testing temperature before stepping into the water. But soon it deepened without either of them forcing it. Diana spoke about her early days in textile design, about how alive she felt discovering new artists. Michael shared his own battles in landscape architecture, his fear of failure, of disappearing into other people's expectations. As they talked, it became clear that both had lived too long trying to be who others needed them to be. They left that first coffee without big promises, just a "let's meet again sometime." But both knew something had shifted, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. Those coffees slowly turned into something bigger than just polite catch-ups. Every time they talked about design, Michael watched a different light come into Diana's eyes. It wasn't the controlled smile she showed at parties. It was the glow of someone reconnecting with an old love. He realized her soul wasn't tired. It was simply locked away, waiting for someone to knock on the door again. One afternoon, while she described a fabric exhibition she'd once seen, he took a risk. "You know you could still be part of that world," he said. "You don't have to be done." Diana laughed softly at first, like he'd made a kind, unrealistic joke. "Michael, I'm 62. Who would hire me now?" she asked, half teasing, half genuinely afraid. He didn't argue with her age. He argued with her belief about her value. He talked about museums, galleries, community projects that needed people who truly understood art. He reminded her that experience doesn't expire. It just gets dusty when nobody uses it. Then he suggested something concrete, writing to a local craft and textile museum to offer her help as a volunteer. A week later, Diana arrived at the cafe with a nervous brightness on her face. She told him she had contacted the museum and, to her surprise, they were excited to meet her. They wanted her to help organize a contemporary textile exhibition, connecting her past life to a new chapter. Michael sat there listening, enjoying how her hands moved as she talked, painting ideas in the air. It was like watching someone take their first deep breath after years of shallow breathing. Even without saying it, he knew this wasn't just a side project. It was Diana taking herself seriously again. Soon, he began helping her with the exhibition, almost without noticing how natural it felt. They discussed where each piece should hang, how visitors would move through the space, what story the room should tell. Diana brought her gift for texture and color. Michael brought his eye for flow, light, and movement. They worked shoulder to shoulder, laughing, debating, testing ideas, and changing things together. And the more they collaborated, the harder it became to pretend it was purely professional. Between fabrics and spotlights, a quiet affection was growing. One neither was ready to name, but both were already feeling. The night of the opening felt like a final exam for this new version of Diana. The museum was full, gentle lighting, hushed voices, people admiring the pieces she'd chosen and arranged. Michael watched her from a distance as she guided visitors, explaining techniques and stories behind each textile. For the first time in decades, she wasn't Thomas's wife or Rebecca's mother. She was just Diana, the designer. When a person starts to inhabit their own name again, something powerful shifts inside. She still didn't know that this same night would show her, brutally, who had never really seen her. Thomas arrived later, sharp suit, polished shoes, the aura of a man who lives in boardrooms. He walked through the exhibition like he was checking a hotel lobby, fast and distracted. He shook hands, greeted the right people, glanced at his phone more than at the artworks. Diana approached him with carefully contained excitement, hoping to share a little of what she'd built. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, said everything looked great, and went back to his messages. Half an hour later, he slipped out, without asking a single question about her favorite piece or her process. As the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, the silence in the hall took on a different weight. Diana sat on a bench in a corner, eyes shining in that way that meant she was holding back tears. Michael sat beside her and asked quietly, "What happened?" Even though he already knew. She didn't start with Thomas. She started with herself, with the ache of feeling like decoration in someone else's life. She admitted that, deep down, she'd always known the marriage was empty, but seeing it so clearly that evening cut deeper than expected. While she spoke, a single tear finally escaped, betraying all the strength she'd tried to carry. Michael did something simple but huge. He slipped an arm around her shoulders and didn't rush to fill the silence. Sometimes the wisest thing you can offer isn't a speech, but a safe place to fall apart. When she let her head rest on his shoulder, the air between them changed. The museum felt very far away. With his heart hammering, he chose honesty over self-protection and admitted he was falling in love with her. Diana said it was impossible, that it didn't make sense, that too many lines were being crossed, and yet she didn't pull away. After a long inner battle written clearly on her face, she leaned in and kissed him, quietly opening a door neither would be able to close without breaking something important. Nothing about their connection could be called innocent after that night. They kept seeing each other, but now there was a truth humming underneath every word. They were in love. They chose quieter cafes, more hidden parks, times when no one from Diana's world was likely to appear. They shared jokes, stories, thoughtful looks that stretched a little too long to be just friendship. But along with the joy, each message and meeting carried its own sting of guilt. Even if the heart doesn't care about titles, both knew they were walking on dangerous ground. Michael lived caught between the deep happiness of being with her and the weight of what it all implied. On one hand, he finally felt truly seen and understood, without needing to perform for anyone. On the other, the shadows of Rebecca and Thomas followed them everywhere, even unnamed. Diana swung between feeling alive for the first time in years and being terrified of destroying her entire world. Every time the home phone rang or an email came from a family contact, her chest tightened. Still, whenever they met, both knew this was no fling. It was something much bigger than a passing distraction. The tension climbed another step the day Rebecca walked into a cafe and spotted Michael alone at a table. She sat with him effortlessly, as if they were just two old acquaintances catching up. They talked about work, weather, little things, until her face shifted and she dropped the question he feared. "Have you been talking to my mom lately?" "She's different," she said, studying him. Rebecca described how Diana was going out more, smiling at her phone, dressing with a new kind of lightness. Then, in a lower voice, she admitted she thought her mother might be having an affair with someone who definitely wasn't her father. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter, but Michael kept his expression painfully neutral. He tried to gently redirect the conversation, suggesting maybe Diana was just happy to be working with what she loved again. Rebecca shook her head, insisting she knew her mother, and this felt like something deeper, more personal. She mentioned a family dinner Diana had skipped for a museum meeting, and the way she blushed at incoming texts. Michael left that cafe with his chest tight and a clear feeling. Their secret was on borrowed time. That pressure, instead of making things clearer, pushed him straight toward a conversation that would change everything. With Rebecca's suspicions ringing in his ears, Michael couldn't keep living as if nothing had changed. He asked Diana to meet him in a quiet park, away from any familiar faces but close to the truth they'd been avoiding. There, on a simple bench, he laid his heart out with a clarity that scared even him. He told her he loved her, but he couldn't keep living in half-shadows and disappearing messages. He needed to know where they were headed, if there was a future that wasn't just hiding. Diana listened with tears in her eyes, knowing he was right and hating how much it hurt to admit it. She confessed she had been thinking about leaving Thomas, that she couldn't stand the lie of their marriage much longer. But the thought of lawyers, money, reputation, family, and social fallout all crashing down at once terrified her. Caught between bravery and panic, she suggested something that felt like a knife to his chest. She asked if they could stop seeing each other for a while. "Just until I get things sorted out," she said, voice trembling. For her, it was a way of protecting him from the coming storm. For him, it sounded like being locked in a waiting room with no idea if the door would ever open again. Michael stood up, anger and sadness battling under his skin. He said he understood the complexity but couldn't just freeze his life while she decided whether he was worth the risk. He told her he was already paying a high price. Whispers at work, lost projects, quiet judgment from people who didn't know the full story. He said he'd swallowed all of that because he believed they were moving towards something real together. Diana cried, repeating that she loved him but needed time not to blow up everything in one reckless move. He heard every word, but walked away with the sharp feeling that, for once, she was choosing the world before choosing them. 3 weeks of heavy silence followed, noisier than any argument they could have had. Michael buried himself in work, taking on extra jobs, staying up late over drawings and models. On the phone, Lucas asked him bluntly if he really wanted to live waiting for someone who hesitated that much. Michael didn't have an easy answer. Heart and logic almost never vote the same way. All he knew was that no matter how hard he tried, every cafe, every park, every tune on the radio still reminded him of her. And neither of them imagined that even in that painful distance, Diana was already pushing something into motion that would lead them back together. One day, in the middle of that forced silence, Michael received a call from a number he didn't recognize. A woman named Jennifer from a local arts coalition told him about a new community project. They wanted someone to design a garden gallery in a neighborhood with almost no access to art or green spaces. Before he could ask how they'd found him, she explained his name had been recommended by Diana. Not only that, Diana's new design collective was the main donor funding the project. Even while they weren't speaking, she had still been quietly opening doors for his career. On the day of the planning meeting, Michael arrived with his sketches and a knot in his stomach. As he presented his ideas to the small team, the conference room door opened. Diana walked in, stopped dead for a second when she saw him, and then recomposed herself. Jennifer, oblivious to the tension, happily commented that this should be easy since they already knew each other. Diana sat as far as she could, her posture strictly professional, her eyes avoiding his. Michael presented a solid, safe design, but nowhere near what he was truly capable of creating. After he finished, Jennifer turned to Diana and asked what she thought. Diana was quiet for a moment, then said something that both hurt and woke him up. She said the plans were good and functional, but that she'd seen other work from him and knew he could do much more. She said he wasn't just someone who placed art and nature side by side. He could make them talk to each other. It stung because it was true. He'd been holding back emotionally, protecting himself. And he knew that if she still believed in his gift, maybe she hadn't walked away from him as completely as he'd feared. After the meeting, he caught up with her in the hallway and asked for 5 minutes. She agreed and led him to a quiet stairwell where office noise faded into the background. There, without a table or coffee cup between them, she finally said what he'd been waiting weeks to hear. She had asked Thomas for a separation, telling him she hadn't been happy in years and didn't want to pretend anymore. Then came the twist. Thomas admitted he'd been seeing someone else abroad for years, almost relieved she'd spoken first. They were now working through the legal and financial details, and she was bracing herself for the fallout with Rebecca. Diana explained that it would not be quick. Lawyers, assets, social ties, and most of all, her daughter. But for the first time, she spoke clearly. She was choosing her own life, and inside that choice, she was choosing Michael too. He felt a rush of relief and hope, like the pain had finally been given a purpose. Just as the air seemed to clear between them, her phone rang with a familiar name on the screen. It was Rebecca, and the panic in Diana's face said it all before she even answered. Because while they'd been walking into that stairwell together, Rebecca had seen them, and what came next would not be easy for anyone. After that call, everything seemed to speed up like a movie on fast forward. Rebecca had seen them disappear into the stairwell and didn't need many details to build her own story. In the following days, Diana called and texted her repeatedly, trying to explain, but got no reply. The silence from her daughter hurt more than the whispers of any outsider. These are the wounds that don't bleed on the outside, but take your breath away all the same. And there is no quick cure for them. Only time, honesty, and a lot of humility. One morning, Diana gathered her strength and went to Rebecca's apartment, determined to talk face to face. She rang the bell and waited, heart pounding, hoping at least to be allowed inside. Rebecca spoke from behind the closed door, voice tight with hurt and anger. She accused her mother of acting like a selfish teenager, throwing away their family's reputation. Then came the sentence that shattered Diana more than any insult could. "I don't have a mother." Those words followed Diana down the stairs like stones tied to her ankles. Meanwhile, Michael began to pay his own quiet price. In the architecture world, gossip travels quickly, and the story about him and an older married woman spread. Some colleagues stopped calling him for collaborations. Others greeted him with forced smiles and curious eyes. No one cared to know the full story. The headline version was enough to judge him. He tried to keep going, but some days he wondered if he was sacrificing his career for something too fragile. Yet every time he imagined walking away from Diana, he knew that would hurt even more than the judgment. Diana, on her side, started to wonder if she was being horribly selfish by finally choosing her own happiness. She asked herself if it would have been better to stay in a dead marriage so everyone else could stay comfortable. But each time she imagined stepping back into that role, she felt like betraying herself all over again. Michael patiently reminded her that living a lie doesn't really keep people happy. It just delays the explosion. The pain still comes. It just arrives later and often hits harder. And even though everything looked like it was falling apart, something new and unexpectedly solid was quietly being born in the middle of the chaos. Even while everything seemed to be on fire around them, something quietly beautiful emerged. The community garden gallery opened, and slowly, the neighborhood began to fill with kids running between plants and art. People who had never stepped into a museum started recognizing colors, textures, and stories on those outdoor walls. Diana and Michael worked there side by side, not just as professionals, but as two people rebuilding themselves. It was ironic. While they lost status and respectability in certain circles, they were gaining meaning in places that had never seen them before. Moments like that remind you that real value rarely lives where people told you to look for it. One random Tuesday, when things were relatively calm, Rebecca walked into the gallery. She didn't arrive with shouting or drama, just with a face marked by tired anger and unresolved questions. She wandered through the space, saw her mother kneeling beside a child, explaining a piece of fabric like nothing else existed. After a while, she asked Diana to talk somewhere private, away from anyone who might overhear. What followed was a hard conversation, accusations, tears, long silences, truths that arrived late but finally arrived. Yet inside all that, a small opening appeared. Rebecca started to see that her mother wasn't playing games, she'd been drowning. 6 months later, Diana's divorce was finalized, without big receptions or smiling photos, just papers, signatures, and long exhaled breaths. She and Michael moved into a modest townhouse stuffed with fabric samples, landscape sketches, and half-finished cups of coffee. Rebecca began coming over for dinner every other week, still cautious, but willing to rebuild something new. The table was small, but the conversations were more honest than any banquet they'd ever attended. Laughter wasn't forced to impress anyone. It showed up when it wanted to. And that kind of simplicity, even if it looks small from the outside, is a wealth that no luxury brand can buy. On the anniversary of that night in the Lavender Garden, Michael prepared a surprise in the gallery they had created together. Among the plants and installations, he got down on one knee and asked Diana to marry him. No grand show, just pure honesty. She said yes with tears that, this time, came from gratitude, not guilt. The wedding was small, Lucas standing proudly by Michael's side, Rebecca in the front row, crying for what was lost and what was rebuilt. Standing there with Diana as his wife, Michael finally understood that the worst that came after that whisper had actually been the cost of leaving a lie behind. And the lesson hanging in the air was simple and demanding. Living truthfully is rarely comfortable, but it will always be worth more than a peaceful-looking lie. Now that you've walked all the way through this story, let me ask you honestly, which side do you see yourself on? On the side of the person who stays in a comfortable but hollow life, or on the side of the one who risks everything for something that finally feels real? Michael and Diana are not just characters. They're mirrors that reflect decisions so many people avoid thinking about. Maybe you're not in a forbidden love, but how many areas of your life are you stuck in just because you're afraid of what people will say? The picture might look perfect from the outside, but it's honesty that lets you breathe on the inside. So the question this story leaves you with is simple. Do you want to keep decorating a lie, or start building a truth, even if it hurts? Think about your relationships, your work, your daily routine. Are you choosing from self-respect or from fear of judgment? Who are you trying to impress by keeping doors closed that no longer do you any good? Sometimes the worst that could happen is exactly what pushes you out of autopilot and back into real life. Yes, living honestly has a price, but staying in a role that isn't yours has a price too. The difference is that one leaves you empty, and the other, sooner or later, leaves you at peace with yourself. So before you go, ask yourself, what hard conversation have you been postponing for years, and what would happen if you took the first step today? Which part of your life needs less performance and more truth, even if that shakes everything up for a while? If this story made you think, feel uncomfortable in a good way, or see your own world differently, don't leave it here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can keep hearing stories that don't just entertain you, but also nudge you toward a braver life. For some people this was just another story, but for you, if you let it, it can be the first crack in a very old mask.